Welcome to the Inquiry. I'm Gregory Harms. Hello again, inquirers. All right, I'm just trying it on. I thought it'd be nice to have a thing that I call the followers or the viewers of this podcast, if it indeed is a podcast. Like have a name, like for the people who view the podcast. Some of my students suggested the Harms Army. I think maybe that's a bit much, but I don't know. We'll work on it. I don't think inquirers is a thing. It doesn't really roll off the tongue, and I think Harms Army is a bit much. But we'll work on it. I'll come up with something. It'll be really fantastic, of course. You know what I discovered recently? And how I discovered it is interesting too. I discovered how much I really like, and I didn't know this because I didn't know anything about it, Bulgarian folk music. That's my new thing. And how I came by Bulgarian folk music is rather interesting. I was watching a clip of an interview by Frank Zappa. Now, I'm not a big fan of his music at all. And I'm not particularly fond of him. I've seen a number of his videos, or his interviews, and I just find him pompous and arrogant and a bit overbearing and generally unpleasant. And I usually, at the end of what I watch or have watched, I end up thinking to myself, why did he do the interview? Why bother? Why do the interview? So there's the fact that I was watching a Frank Zappa interview is curious, because I don't watch Frank Zappa interviews. I don't like him. I don't find him entertaining, or occasionally he comes up with a good political zinger, but I mean, other than that, I don't find him very pleasant. Kind of like Lou Reed, the both of them. I don't know why they did half the interviews they did, because they're not particularly nice to the interviewer, and they come off as pompous and disappointed and arrogant, and Lou Reed and Frank Zappa, there's two interviewees I just don't go looking for. So I was watching this Frank Zappa interview, and the interviewer asked him about asked him questions about rock and roll bands, and he said, "I'm not a consumer of rock and roll. I don't buy rock and roll records." And the interviewer's like, "What do you listen to?" And then one of the first things he said was, "I listen to Bulgarian folk music." And I thought to myself, I don't know anything about Bulgarian folk music. So I looked it up on YouTube, and I was like, kind of like that. Here's some. Yeah, I'll take that over Led Zeppelin any day of the week. I really like that. Bulgarian folk music. So thanks, Frank, wherever you are. Yeah. And can I just say one thing? I really like the Supremes.
Instead of breaking up, let's do some kissing and making up. Don't throw our love.
I just really like them. I just wanted to say that. Okay. So Vietnam, big topic. Major event in U.S. and Vietnamese history. Major event, period. Didn't have to happen at all. So what I want to do today is I want to. I don't want to bury you guys in dates and names and details and stuff. I don't want this to be like a lecture. It's still kind of a lecture, but it's not. You know what I'm saying. I don't want it to be like, oh, cripes. That's a lot of information. There is a lot to cover, but I think we can crunch this down. This might be a short episode. I don't know. I just very simply, I'd be happy making this a 5-minute long episode. I want you to understand why that happened. That's all I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to go into the details of the major events or the stuff you normally hear about when you hear about Vietnam. I'm not going to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin. I'm not going to talk about the Tet Offensive. I'm not going to talk about the My Lai Massacre. I'm not going to talk about the Ho Chi Minh Trail or I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. I'm not going to talk about this the breadth of the war itself. I'm not going to go into that stuff. I'm going to talk about why it happened. That's what interests me the most. Even in my studies, I've always, my focus in my work and in my writing has always been the Middle East. But that includes U.S. foreign policy, and Vietnam. The Vietnam War has been sort of a side project, if you will. I've read a lot about it. For years. It's always been like a side thing that I studied. There is an unbelievable amount of literature on the subject, surveys of the entire war, books on particular aspects of the war, biographies of some of the principal actors in the war. I mean, it doesn't stop. There's, an unbelievable literature on the subject. Yeah, I don't want to go over. I don't want to cover the span of the conflict. I just want to talk about why it happened, and I want to talk about it in a very simple way, so you can come away with a sense of, oh, okay, that's what it's about, or that's what it was about, or that's why we went there. I don't want this to be too name and date, heavy, So Where to begin? Well, I think I talked about this in the Iran episode. I talked about some of the key principles of U.S. foreign policy and the Cold War, and that you have to understand that. Otherwise, none of this will make any sense. So, real quick, you got to know something about the United States has always been expansionist. Okay, some of this will be a rehash of what we talked about at the beginning of the Iran episode. But I got to go over it because, it just doesn't make any sense otherwise. Like, why would the United States, the richest, most powerful country in the world, involve itself in this small agrarian country the size of New Mexico on the other side of the world? It doesn't make any sense. It does make sense if you look at the priorities that prevailed and prevail in Washington, D.C., especially the White House. President to president to president to president. It cuts across, one administration after another. So the United States has always been expansionist. It was expansionist continentally. After 1945, after the World War II, they could take their expansionism global. In 1823, the President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine. Did I say 1823? Did I say that already? Yeah, I think I said 1823. And basically, just simply put, the Monroe Doctrine said to Europe, this half of the globe is ours. That's basically what he said. Central and South America are hands off. He paid some lip service to independence of states and stuff, but that never a priority in Washington. The independence of these states, or any states, developing states. This half of the world is ours. So Europe, butt out. That's basically what it said. And then in 1904. President Teddy Roosevelt put a twist on it. He issued what's called the Roosevelt Corollary, and the Roosevelt Corollary dialed it up a couple notches and said any country or state guilty of wrongdoing or impotence, his words, will be dealt with. He invoked the concept of a police power, in that you would be dealt with. Uncle Sam would deal with you as a police power in the event you were guilty or found guilty of impotence or wrongdoing. So Uncle Sam was pretty clear on these points, and then enter the Cold War. That is the bipolar contest between Washington and Moscow, which was mostly theater. Okay, after World War II, you got these two major powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, and we wore the white hat, of course, and they wore the black hat. Like that, Moscow was tantamount to Mordor, and it was just evil, and everything they did was evil, and everything they stood for was evil, and we're the good guys, we're the capitalists, we believe in liberty and democracy, oh, be still my beating heart. And so that was the Cold War set in, and then Washington, D.C. could justify everything it did around the world and do it in the name of national security, and blame everything on the Soviets. So, we got involved in Vietnam. We got involved in Vietnam because, this might be, the communists they might expand into Southeast Asia, and beyond Southeast Asia, there was concern of the communists entering Australia, which is interesting. So this gets kind of paranoid and weird But if we just look at the Cold War for what it is, and there is a very rich and detailed literature on this subject, and there are very large, heavily footnoted books on this subject. This has been covered in detail. Every detail's been footnoted, and the declassified record has been gone through with a fine-tooth comb, and seriously scholarly work has been done on the Cold War, which really kicked in, with the Truman administration. And then it goes into the Eisenhower administration. But the Truman administration is really when it kicked into high gear. So a lot of this was theater. We could just blame the Soviets for whatever. It doesn't matter, and we could chalk up everything to national security. One of the principal policy architects, George F. Kennan, he said in a speech he gave at the National War College in 1949. I'll read this. This is just unbelievable. He didn't view communism so much as the disease, but a complication, and that the United States should not get too violently indignant over the fact that such a complication exists. As one of my associates recently said, if it had never existed, we would have had to invent it to create the sense of urgency we need to bring us to the point of decisive action. Well, the priority was decisive action. And, there's George F. Kennan, one of the key policy architects during the Cold War, addressing the National War College. And he says, well, if it didn't exist, we'd have to make it up. That tells you a lot. See, it's important to keep in mind that when you're reading about this stuff, about U.S. foreign policy, about the Cold War, about whatever, you have to keep in mind that there are basically two types of heads of state, two types of policy planners, people like Kennan. There are believers, people who actually believe the catechism, that they believe what they're peddling. And then there are the unbelievably sober, business-like, business-minded people like Kennan, and to go back to the Monroe Doctrine, his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. These are not sentimental people. They are not believers. They view the world in very sober, calculating terms, and they do not believe the catechism. They do not believe the doctrine. There were believers. There were people who were legit concerned about Moscow and about Soviet expansion and so on and so forth. But the real, the people who, viewed the world in very clinical, sober terms, never believe that. Not for 1 second. And if you go through the scholarly literature, the heavily footnoted big books, they're pretty clear on it, that the Soviet Union was not looking to get into adventures that it was on, that Stalin and the Soviet Union were on a defensive footing, and they weren't looking to spread their tentacles and take over the world. That was ludicrous. But that's what was getting peddled in Washington D.C. at the time, not by careful, sober thinkers like Kennan. We would have had to have made it up. So it was theater, but it was really handy theater if decisive action, quote unquote, is the priority, and that was the priority. So, why Vietnam? Okay, in order to understand Vietnam and why that even ended up on Washington's radar, you need to understand that Vietnam was under French imperial control. Okay? The French set up shop in Vietnam. They controlled Vietnam. They subjugated Vietnam. They conducted an extractive economy. They made the people who live there miserable. They conducted very dislocating, jarring, carried out policies that were damaging to the economy, damaging to, the production of food and the production of, resources and so on. It was thoroughly unpleasant. And the French set up shop there in the mid-1800s, and they'd been there ever since. Okay, but there's something going on around the world, and that is the colonized, the people living under imperial domination, are pushing back. And it's happening all over the place. It's happening in Central America. It's happening in Africa. It's happening in the Middle East. We've seen that. We've seen that in Iran, during the when I did the Iran episode. Same story. So the Vietnamese begin to push back against French control. Okay, so a sense of nationalism takes root in Vietnam, and it has a face and a name. And that face and that name belonged to Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the face of Vietnamese nationalism. Okay, so he was a very popular guy, immensely popular from one end of Vietnam to the other. It's a long, slender country. He was very popular, beloved by the Vietnamese people, and he was one willing to get up on his hind legs and challenge French authority. Okay, so now tensions are building in Vietnam. I'm getting a lot of text. I'm very popular. I gotta take a sip. 1 second. I won't talk about it. My sip. I'm just gonna have one. It's very refreshing. I'm not going to talk about it though. I gotta stop doing that. So I'm going to stop doing that. Okay. But it was very refreshing. So, where was I? So tensions are building in Vietnam between the increasing sense of nationalism in the country and French interests to continue their, colonial program. Continue dominating the country. So this is getting hot, and this is when Vietnam ends up on Washington's radar, and Washington's like, "What's going on in Vietnam?" They quickly put that together. That wasn't difficult. And they automatically looked at Ho Chi Minh as, oh, this guy's trouble. Because anybody who, was a nationalist, anyone who fought for, or stood up and represented, the rights of the people living there, the rights of the peasants, the rights of the farmers, the rights of ordinary people living in the country. Anyone who stood up for those people was automatically branded as trouble. The Secretary of State under Truman, Dean Acheson, he said that Stalinists are nationalists. So if you're a nationalist, you're automatically a Stalinist. So you're automatically trouble. And Ho Chi Minh was branded as trouble. As a potential Stalinist, as a potential Soviet pawn. Vietnam was viewed as a potential falling domino. Now, I'll talk about that for a moment. The domino theory. I touched on this during the Iran episode, but I want to go over it again. The domino theory is the theory. It's based on an informal fallacy called slippery slope. One thing happens, and one thing happens, and one thing happens, and one thing happens. And politicians use this all the time, and it's fallacious. It's logically, it's an illegitimate form of argumentation. So the domino theory simply states, or you could put it in simple terms, that any state that could potentially fall to communism would be like knocking over a domino, and then all the other dominoes fall. So any state that is attempting to steer its own course, cut its own path, pursue autonomy, that's impotence and wrongdoing, as far as Uncle Sam is concerned. So got to be dealt with. Got to be subjected to a police power, French or otherwise, French or American or whatever. So in this case, French. It wasn't just communism, though. It was any state, any developing country, typically one that was poor, undeveloped, agrarian, what have you. Any state that was, attempting to cultivate autonomy, to steer its own path, to, attempt to achieve independence from their imperial overlords. If they get funny ideas, if this undeveloped, poor, and agrarian country is successful in steering its own path, then there's a risk of other small, undeveloped agrarian countries developing, pushing for their independence. Can't have that. The world's undeveloped countries are all independent and stand on their own 2 feet and are autonomous. Then Uncle Sam can't show up and dominate that country, or Europe can't dominate that country. So this gets out of hand, given the priorities. This gets out of hand, and we can't have that. So the dominoes, there's a bunch of different metaphors that get used. Rotten apples in a barrel, rotten meat. I think onions got used once or twice. There's a bunch of metaphors. But the idea is that, if one apple gets rotten, it threatens the other apples in the barrel. So that's the domino theory. You knock over one domino, and then they're all going to go, They're all going to fall. So you got to nip it in the bud. You got to subject this country that's guilty of wrongdoing and impotence to a police power. They need to be, dealt with. They need to be punished. And then the other small undeveloped states will get the message and be like, okay, so we're gonna cooperate. We're gonna cooperate with Uncle Sam's way of doing things and their priorities. That's what Uncle Sam wants at this point, is cooperation and obedience. So I don't know why I said that so evil. Obedience. I said that it was kind of sinister, wasn't it? Obedience. I didn't mean to be dramatic, guy. That's just how it came out. Why did I say it like that? I think I eat too much peanut butter. I really like peanut butter. I just eat it out of the jar with a spoon. Skippy Natural, the brown lid. I've always been a creamy peanut butter guy, and then I got into chunky peanut butter for a minute, and then I went back to creamy peanut butter. I don't know. A student kind of brought this into focus for me. A student said, chunky peanut butter is like the machine broke. before it finished making the peanut butter. And then, like, the company's like, well, we'll just, I don't know, we'll call it Chunky. And then they put that in the jar, you know. So ever since he said that, I was like, God, that is what it's like. It's like the machine broke, and they didn't finish making the peanut butter. And they're just, okay, put it in the jar and call it Chunky. So I went back to creamy peanut butter. I have no idea what the hell I'm talking about this for. Inquirers? That's not a great name. I'll think of a better name. Domino theory? Yeah. So any state guilty of, this is tantamount, this is trouble. Ho Chi Minh, this has got to be dealt with. This is a problem. This guy wants to unify, and not unify, but kind of unify and create an independent and vibrant Vietnam, which he announced at the end of World War II. He announced almost. I posted a thing on my blog on the 80th anniversary of September 2nd. On September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh declared independence for Vietnam. Well, there were 3 different countries in his country. Nevertheless, that he did that, and he had already tried to contact Woodrow Wilson, former President Woodrow Wilson, who paid a lot of lip service to, independence, and has issued his 14 points, and, so on and so forth. Paid a lot of lip service to the development of these countries, independence, and so on. But that's, there's what Woodrow Wilson said, and then there's what Woodrow Wilson did. And one of the things Woodrow Wilson did was to ignore Ho Chi Minh. It was at Versailles that Ho Chi Minh tried to reach out to Woodrow Wilson because he was looking for American support, because he understandably thought that, the Americans seem to be on the side of the colonized and they're in favor of independence. Wrong-o, Ho Chi Minh. Uncle Ho, as he was nicknamed. No. But, you can't blame the guy for thinking that, because that's all they said. So Woodrow Wilson ignored him. He tried again, Ho Chi Minh. He reached out to Harry S. Truman, and he got ignored again. But when he declared independence, and he declared Vietnam an independent country on September 2nd, 80 years ago, while he was doing so, he quoted Thomas Jefferson. And there was a brass band, and they played the Star-Spangled Banner. They were kind of gung-ho American liberalism. They were really taken with the Declaration of Independence, and they thought, okay, Uncle Sam's going to be a source of support. Oh my God, no. Uncle Sam's not going to be it's going to be a source of misery and nothing else, a source of pain and death, not a source of support. The Americans are watching this very closely. And Ho Chi Minh was not a potential Soviet pawn. Ho Chi Minh was not a communist. Ho Chi Minh did visit Moscow with limited success. And the Soviets just weren't that interested in Vietnam ever. And Ho Chi Minh had read as Lenin, but I don't think that makes him a communist. I've read my fair share of Marx, some Lenin, and I'm not a communist. I'm just not interested. I wouldn't. I called myself a Marxist like back in the early '90s. I thought I was a Marxist, but I'm not a Marxist. I don't even know what that means. Marxist. I don't even know what that means. But in 1991, I'm a Marxist. Yeah, of course you are, Greg. Of course you are. Yeah, well, that was one of the prototypes. Me. And I thought I was a Marxist. I thought I was a Hegelian for a minute. I thought I was a Husserlian. I just wanted to be somebody. God, to be young again. And no way, I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't go back for anything. Ugh. Anything before 2002, forget it. I just have nothing to really. I just wince. Anything before 2002. After 2002, okay, fine. I start to, grow up and intellectually sort of come into my own. But before 2002, I cringe. I guess that's a popular word now. Cringe. I cringe. Yeah. A Marxist. So Ho Chi Minh wasn't a Marxist. He wasn't a Soviet. He wasn't a communist. He wasn't anything of the sort. He was looking to, create an independent and vibrant Vietnam. That's it. And he made repeated appeals and overtures to, American presidents, and was just flat out ignored. So that's interesting. Nevertheless, that's how they viewed him. That's how they viewed the situation in Vietnam. And that's what was expected of the French. To control this place. It's getting out of control, and the French need to impose control. So that is the expectation of the French. Now, the French, what they were doing was globally unpopular because many imperial powers were discontinuing their colonial programs, especially after World War II. The French thought it added to their prestige somehow by maintaining control of Vietnam. This was not popular, and Uncle Sam was aware of this. Uncle Sam was aware that this was not a popular thing, so Uncle Sam didn't want to be viewed as just outright supporting French domination of Vietnam. But that is basically what they were doing. They paid some lip service to, Vietnamese independence and so on, but behind the curtain, that's what was going on. Is the Washington expected the French to impose greater control. And at one point, one of the French heads of state, no, I think it was a commander, French military commander, said that they were going to perfect their control of Vietnam. Perfect. And at one point in Washington, they were talking about the French winning in Vietnam. I don't know what that means. To win when you're trying to control a country that's not yours. I don't know what winning means, but this increasingly became unstable, and this got hot. So eventually, at one point, Uncle Sam was footing about 80% of the bill. They wanted France to bring down the hammer harder. And the French were criticized in Washington as lacking the will. That was the word that was used. They lacked the will to deal with Vietnam in a sufficiently brutal manner. Uncle Sam could do it. Uncle Sam knew how to get a bigger hammer and use it. Uncle Sam did not lack the will. But Vietnam belonged to France, and the United States was content with footing the bill, just expecting France to, turn up the heat as it did so. Fast forward to, so the French call it quits eventually. There was a battle at Dien Bien Phu in the far north. It was the Ho Chi Minh's party, the Viet Minh, not to be confused with the Viet Cong. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Viet Minh, that was Ho Chi Minh's party, and they really took the fight to France in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In terms of battle logistics, the Viet Minh put on a masterclass. They had farmers and peasants, half of whom were women, bringing equipment and artillery, up into the mountains, and then they just, imposed a siege on the French position in Dien Bien Phu, and it was a rout, and the Viet Minh performed quite well militarily, and at the end of that, one of the French military commanders said, "C'est fini," that's finished, like we're done, like they just can't do this anymore. Right after Dien Bien Phu, you got the Geneva Accords. So the problem in Vietnam, was internationalized, and the Soviet Union and China and Great Britain, they cut the country in half at the 17th parallel. They bisected the country, cut it right in half, temporarily, according to the Geneva Accords. So there's now North Vietnam and there's South Vietnam. The bisecting line is the 17th parallel. And then, according to the Geneva Accords, 2 years after the Accords, there were to be top-down North and South elections, and then you get rid of the line of the 17th parallel and the demilitarized zone, the DMZ. So the Americans did not sign the Geneva Accords. Everybody else did, and the Washington made some tepid, statements of acknowledgement of the Geneva Accords, but they basically wanted nothing to do with it because it spelled independence for Vietnam, and it just wasn't. Uncle Sam's never in the business of doing that. After the Geneva Accords, the Viet Minh and the people, that were loyal to Ho Chi Minh and whatnot, were interested in resisting the French, moved to the north. And then the French moved to the south. So now you got a French concentration in the south, and you got this so-called communist, but it was basically communist in name only. It was nominally communist because they were, receiving support and aid from China. So they weren't really, I think to use the word communist is a bit of a stretch. Then you get the French in the south. So now the priority is the south. Washington, D.C. is not thrilled with this arrangement, because it feels like maybe well, not maybe, it's lost North Vietnam to, North Vietnam has fallen, all right, to communism, which is not what happened. And so now the priority is South Vietnam. South Vietnam is, the last hope for preventing, the spread of the disease, right? So the French call it quits eventually. Not long after the Geneva Accords, they call it quits, and the Americans sponsor a dictator by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem, and he's their guy. He's a Catholic, which is curious because most of Vietnam is Buddhist. But the Americans love a Catholic, and he hated the French, which is fine, and he wanted to consolidate control in South Vietnam, which he was pretty successful for a minute of consolidating that control in Vietnam or in South Vietnam, but resistance began heating up in South Vietnam, and you have the emergence of the National Liberation Front, nicknamed the Viet Cong. Viet Cong is short for Vietnamese. It's basically a derogatory term. Means Vietnamese communists. Okay, the Viet Cong were not interested in anything Soviet or Chinese. They were interested in the French getting the hell out of, and then Diem, overthrowing Diem in the South. So they were a resistance movement. When you push on people like that, you tend to get resistance movements. That's how it works. So the NLF emerged, and they began assassinating politicians that were loyal to Diem, and it got pretty hot. And so the priority becomes to save, if that's the word, save in quotes, according to Washington's perspective, save Vietnam, save South Vietnam, right? So they started corralling peasants and farmers into what are called strategic hamlets. They basically ghettoized these people, put them into these small, little small communities. They're basically ghettos, huts, and to keep them away from the resistance, so the resistance wouldn't spread. This got strange and got supremely violent, and eventually, the DM was assassinated, along with a bunch of his other, lieutenants, and that's when America stepped in. That's when America said, all right, we're going to lose South Vietnam to the Viet Cong. That is the NLF, National Liberation Front. That's when America stepped in. And by this time, John F. Kennedy was president, and he started pouring troops into South Vietnam because they were afraid that South Vietnam was going to be lost, or it was going to fall, or whatever, the language, according to the domino theory. So that was the priority. So the Americans stepped into South Vietnam to prevent it from falling, or prevent its loss. That is, the National Liberation Front, all they wanted was an independent Vietnam, just like they wanted in the North. The DRV, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, that was Ho Chi Minh's. The North was the DRV. The South was the RVN, the Republic of Vietnam. Both North and South wanted the same thing. They wanted an independent Vietnam. And they didn't want American or Chinese or French or anybody else managing their affairs. It had nothing to do with communism. It had nothing to do with communism whatsoever. So yeah, that's the beginning of the Vietnam War, is trying to control, trying to impose a political order on South Vietnam, despite intense resistance from the South Vietnamese. And that's why Uncle Sam got a bigger hammer and brought it down harder, and then brought it down harder, and then brought it down harder. That's the Vietnam War. That's what set this whole thing in train. There are many films about Vietnam. You've probably seen a number of films of Vietnam. I've seen many, not all of them, but I mean, I've seen a good many. And you know, the major titles, you know, like Apocalypse Now.
Someday this war's gonna end.
The Deer Hunter, Platoon, and so on. You know, every Vietnam film I've seen, 100% of the Vietnam films I've seen, do not talk about what I just talked about. They just plunge you right into the rice paddies and the helicopters and the Hueys, and that's you know, that's what they do. You know, I've noticed this in film. There's an effort to create a certain realism about what it was like on the ground. What was it like? So when you watch Saving Private Ryan, for example, you know, when the Americans stormed the beach, that's probably what it would look like. I mean, that's probably pretty close. You know, I think they did a pretty good job of making that look like, yeah, that's probably pretty much what it was like. And if you watch Platoon, for example, that's I mean, it's a movie and there's plot points and characters and stuff, but that's probably more or less what it was like for the GIs fighting in the jungle. That's probably pretty close. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not a documentary, but it's pretty close. I think that would be pretty close to the actual experience. So this seems to be the priority, but the priority doesn't seem to be the politics or the history. Filmmakers don't seem really interested in politics or history, or turning films into books. They just don't deal with that very well. You know, it's like I just saw, well, not a couple of years ago, the what do you call Oppenheimer film, based on a pretty sizable biography by Kay Bird and I think Martin Sherwin. Do I have that last name right? Martin Sherwin. The film just ends. Like, okay, the bomb goes off and he feels bad, and then credits. And I'm like, there's more to it than that. Did the filmmakers read the book they were creating? I mean, they're trying to recreate in film. I think they skipped the last 100 pages because there's a lot more to that story than just the bomb going off and him feeling bad. Filmmakers are terrible at this, and they're terrible at history, and they just don't seem to be particularly interested. Must be hard being a filmmaker. They're too busy, you know, being important, doing important work. They're visionaries. Can't be bogged down in stuff like facts and details. You know. So that's what you get when you watch the Vietnam movies. And that's how America has learned about Vietnam. By watching those movies. And we go to the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C., and we lost 58,000 military personnel, which is not to be taken lightly. That didn't have to happen. We shouldn't have lost 58,000 people in Vietnam. We should have lost 0. The 0 is the correct number. 58,000 is a disgrace. is a national disgrace. But the United States never shies away from an opportunity to misuse and mistreat its own military. It's done it for quite a long time, and Vietnam is a sparkling example. But then we forget, when we're focused on the fact that we lost 58,000 military personnel, that the Vietnamese lost between 2 and 3 million. We miss that detail. We focus on our own losses. We don't pay much attention to the fact that we destroyed a country and killed 2 to 3 million people. You know. And if you talk about the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia, the knock-on effects of this reached into Laos and reached into Cambodia, and yeah, that's none of this had to happen. None of this had to happen. I mean, we could blame John F. Kennedy, but I mean, you have to blame Truman and Eisenhower too, and all the people around him, and the policy architects and the planners, and you know, the defenders of the faith, and yeah, the people who promoted the catechism. You know, they all have blood on their hands, all of them. It didn't have to happen. It was, yeah, not 58,000. The correct number is 0. We should have lost 0 people in Vietnam, because 0 is the number of people, the number of Americans who should have gone to Vietnam. No American military, you know, no GI, no member of the military should have set foot in that country. Should have been at home, you know, training and building stuff, you know, not doing that. I'll leave you with this. We know the imagery that came out of that war. We know the common, the classic images, and they tell a pretty horrifying story. I think. They don't think, they do tell a horrifying story. Must have been in the late 90s, I guess. Must have been in the late 90s. I was going to meet up with a friend, and the friend wasn't, I guess, home from work or something like that. I can't remember. But, so I decided to kill some time in a bar. This was at a time when I didn't always use my time wisely. And so I was sitting in this bar at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And the bar is it's basically empty. You know, there was a guy sitting at the bar. So I kind of pulled up a bar stool in his general vicinity. And I looked at him, and I guessed him to be a Vietnam vet. Didn't require a lot of detective work. He had on the beret and the sleeveless jean jacket, and he's covered in patches and pins and emblems, and he's covered in it. I'm like, that's a Vietnam vet. Okay. We got talking, and he was a nice guy. You know, a pretty pleasant guy. And we're just sitting there drinking beer and having a chat. And this guy, pleasant as he was damaged. He was talking to me. It wasn't really a conversation. He's just talking. I wouldn't call it a dialogue necessarily, but I was perfectly content to listen. I wanted to hear what he had to say, and he would talk about, like, there was a lot of bravado and what kind of badass he was and all this crazy stuff that happened during the war, and then he'd like bottom out, and then his head would, like, his posture would change, and his head would hang, his eyes would well up with tears, and I'm like, this guy is rapid cycling right in front of my eyes. And he was. And I looked at this poor fella, and I thought, it's still 1968 for him. He's still there. Like, mentally, yeah, he's sitting in this bar, but mentally, he's still there. He's still in country. He can still hear the helicopters and, you know, the gunfire and stuff. I mean, he's still... I felt really bad for him, and it kind of breaks my heart that he wasn't in a wheelchair, he wasn't missing a limb, there wasn't anything visible in terms of, you know, injuries, maybe some injuries that I can't see, but nothing really serious like missing his legs or anything like that, but he was damaged psychologically. This guy was in a bar at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so was I, but he was self-medicating because he's trying to stop what's in his head, and I was just killing time and using my time poorly. But he was there for a reason. He was there to, he was there to self-medicate. And I felt so bad for this guy. I still do. And the reason I bring him up is he said something to me. He said the most accurate and honest thing I've ever heard said about the Vietnam War. Like, I've done a fair amount of reading and, you know, watched documentaries and lectures and stuff like that, but this guy, in one sentence, said more than, you know, more than most on the subject. And it was the most honest, like I said, it was the most honest and accurate thing I think I'd ever heard said about the Vietnam War, especially from someone who was there. And that was the following sentence. And I'm going to say it and try to keep my composure, and not get emotional, which I kind of feel I already am a little bit. Talking about this guy's hard. He said, all we did was go over there and fuck those people up. That's it. That's the Vietnam War. I hope you have a better understanding of the basics of why we went there. Next on the inquiry, I don't know. It's either going to be Michael and I talking about Orientalism, or I really want to do a history of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran and all that stuff. I really want to do that. So I don't know if the next one will be Orientalism or the Islam, but one of those two, I think. That'd be the next topic. I know I have like zero credibility when it comes to this, but you gotta believe me. You gotta believe me. All right, thank you for joining me on this episode of The Inquiry.